Hey everyone, this is the commentary version of the Vorkuta mission from Call of Duty Black Ops. In this video, we will dive into the context of post World War II clandestine operations and Soviet gulags, more specifically Vorkutlag, one of the most notorious Soviet gulags. We will also cover the many different reasons Americans have ended up in Soviet work camps during that time. I chose to do a playthrough of the Call of Duty Black Ops mission Vorkuta for the project because we had to relate the subject to a part of history. I believe since there were Americans who were held prisoner at Soviet forced labor camps, that this is a part of American history. Vorkuta is a city in Russia that had a labor camp known as Vorkutlag. Established in 1932, Vorkutlag existed until 1962, and the game notes that the year that the protagonist, Alex Mason, is escaping the gulag is 1963. So this is the right time period, but not completely accurate because the escape takes place 1 year after Fort Kutlag was shut down. Some of the weapons in the mission are accurate, such as the Makarov AK 47 and the KS 23. Americans have escaped Soviet labor camps, but certainly not in the fashion in which the game makes the player undertake. John Noble was an American who lived in Nazi Germany during World War II after his father traded their family business in the States for a company in Germany. Noble was arrested by Soviet authorities who occupied Germany after the war in 1945. He was sent to Vorkuta. The scholarly article, The Gulag System in Northern Siberia, The Creation and Evolution of Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kolyma, discusses John Noble's time at Vorkutlag and the things he had to learn and do to survive. The article also discusses different labor camp inmate uprisings, basically riots, including an uprising that occurred in Vorkuta in 1947, in which inmates were able to take over a few nearby prison camps but were ultimately all executed for their efforts. Elizabeth Austin states that there was an uprising in 1953, and this is basically what Vorkutlag is known for the most. The uprising took place while John Noble was imprisoned there. It makes you wonder if he participated in the riot or not. Like, was there a sense of desperation after being there for 8 years already that may have made him want to participate in the riot, or was he thinking about survival and didn't want to participate because he could get killed for doing so? So I have the fireplace going. That's the popping noise that you hear. I'm also trying to play the game and commentate at the same time, speaking clearly. And this is beginning to be a bit much, so I'm going to pass it on to my assistant, Alyssa, so she could explain more of the content while I handle the gameplay.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa. So let's dive right into the historical backdrop of what's being covered today. Vorkuta was one of the largest and most notorious labor camps in the Soviet Gulag system. Tucked away in the Arctic Circle in the Komi Republic, after World War II, it actually held some Americans who were caught up in the tensions of the era, often accused of espionage or other political offenses. After World War II, American clandestine operations really ramped up, especially with the CIA targeting Soviet networks. They did everything from exfiltrating defectors to supporting underground groups in Eastern Europe. Now, when it comes to Vorkutalag, it was one of the harshest Arctic camps, infamous for its brutal conditions and a big prisoner uprising in 1953. The Gulag system overall was massive and included millions of prisoners used as forced labor for Soviet industrial projects. The US was always eager to gather intelligence from defectors and learn about the Gulag's role in Soviet military and industrial efforts. Many Gulag camps, including Vorkuta, were originally established in the 1930s during the massive Soviet industrialization drive, but they grew even larger in the post-war period. The Soviet government used these remote camps to exploit natural resources like timber, gold, and coal, which were crucial for the Soviet economy. Vorkuta's coal output was particularly valuable because it was used to fuel heavy industry in the Western Soviet Union. Conditions in the mines were brutal, with prisoners working long hours in dangerous conditions, often with inadequate clothing or food. Some former Gulag inmates recalled that survival often depended on forming close-knit groups that could share food, provide mutual support, and help each other survive the harsh winters. American intelligence in the early Cold War years was deeply interested in the flow of prisoners in and out of these camps as a way to map Soviet internal security. The presence of foreign prisoners, including Americans, was often used in propaganda by both sides, by the Soviets to claim they had caught spies, and by the West to highlight Soviet repression. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a gradual thaw, and many political prisoners were released in the late 1950s, although some camps continued to operate for many years. The legacy of the Gulag system became a major point of discussion during the later Cold War era, as dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn published detailed accounts that reached a global audience. Even today, historians are still uncovering new information about how these camps functioned and the lives of those who were imprisoned there. In the wake of World War II, American intelligence agencies often relied on former Axis operatives to gather information on the Soviet Union, sometimes leading to morally gray alliances. Vorkuta, as a Gulag camp, had an international population that included not just Americans, but also Germans, Poles, and citizens of various satellite states who were considered politically unreliable. The camp was crucial for coal production, and that coal helped fuel Soviet industries during the Cold War era. Prisoners in a Gulag system often developed underground culture, sharing songs, stories, and survival strategies, which sometimes made their way back to the West through defectors. The Vorkuta uprising of 1953, while ultimately suppressed, did lead to some minor reforms in how the Soviet Union managed its prison camps. The Gulag system as a whole began to be scaled back after Stalin's death, although it never fully vanished until the late Soviet period. American intelligence remained interested in Gulag information not only for humanitarian reasons, but also to gauge the stability of the Soviet regime. They saw how the pre-minute prisoners could indicate broader political trends or weaknesses. Some former prisoners who managed to escape eventually wrote memoirs that became key sources for Western understanding of Soviet repression. And the harshness of places like Vorkuta became symbolic of the entire Cold War struggle between East and West. You know, one aspect of Cold War history that often goes unnoticed is the fate of American POWs after World War II. Some of these soldiers, captured in the final days of the conflict, ended up in Soviet labor camps like Vorkuta, often under mysterious circumstances. During the early Cold War, American intelligence operations, such as aerial reconnaissance missions, sometimes led to pilots and agents being captured by the Soviets. Many of them were detained in special regime camps, hidden from the public eye, and their stories remained classified for many years. Additionally, some American civilians found themselves caught up in this geopolitical tension, and they too could end up in Soviet camps under similar circumstances. We can also look at how the game's narrative intertwines with the real experiences of defectors and how their stories often shaped Western understanding of the Soviet system. And of course, the game also subtly nods to the technology and code-breaking efforts that both sides invested in, like the infamous Enigma and the American counterparts. It's definitely a blend of realism and creative license. The game really does capture the harsh conditions and isolation of Vorkuta, as well as that atmosphere of oppression and forced labor. However, some elements like the dramatic escape and the intensity of certain events are definitely exaggerated for cinematic effect. In reality, while Vorkuta was extremely harsh, it didn't always play out in the same dramatic way depicted in the game. So basically, it's inspired by reality, but with some fictional flair. After World War II, clandestine operations became a major focus for both the United States and the Soviet Union, and there were some very real reasons for that shift. The world had just watched the consequences of open, large-scale warfare, and neither side wanted another global conflict. Instead, they turned to the shadows, to intelligence work, covert missions, and deniable actions, because it allowed them to compete without triggering a full military showdown. One of the biggest motivations was the rapid spread of nuclear technology. Now that the stakes were literally world-ending, both sides needed detailed, accurate information about each other's capabilities. That pushed espionage and covert surveillance to the front of national strategy. The US wanted to know how fast the Soviets were developing weapons. The Soviets wanted to know how far ahead the Americans really were. Information became as valuable as armies. At the same time, the political landscape changed almost overnight. Countries collapsed, borders shifted, old alliances dissolved, and entire regions were suddenly up for influence. Covert operations became the tool for shaping those outcomes, whether it was supporting friendly governments, undermining rival ones, or quietly gathering intelligence on whoever filled the power vacuum. And there was another element too. Both sides were terrified of infiltration. The fear that the enemy might plant agents inside government, military, or scientific institutions created a constant pressure to expand counterintelligence. Every breakthrough in code breaking, surveillance, or psychological operations pushed the field a little further. All of this turned clandestine work into its own battlefield, one fought with spies, analysts, defectors, coded messages, and covert missions instead of tanks and bombs. And that secret conflict ran underneath almost every major event of the Cold War. It shaped policies, influenced wars, and even affected how ordinary people lived, even if they never knew it. American civilians who crossed borders at the wrong moment or were accused of espionage without real evidence often found themselves trapped in the Soviet system. Once the Soviets decided an American belonged in custody, the chances of them returning home became extremely slim. The Soviet state treated these prisoners with complete secrecy. There were no public records, no formal announcements, and no communication with families back in the United States. Many of these Americans were classified as special prisoners, and that label meant their existence could be denied if anyone ever asked about them. It also meant harsher conditions, tighter surveillance, and very little contact with other inmates. Life inside these camps was a mix of survival, suspicion, and isolation. American prisoners were watched more closely than almost anyone else. Some were kept separate from the general population, others were blended in with political prisoners from dozens of countries. In that world, nationality didn't protect you. Being American often made things harder. Even after the Cold War ended, a lot of these stories remained incomplete because the Soviet archives kept so many files sealed. But the accounts that did surface through defectors, former prisoners, and partial records show that Americans in the Gulag were not myths or exaggerations. They were real people who disappeared into a system built to erase identities and bury the truth. Their experiences reveal just how far the Soviet state was willing to go and how easily someone could vanish behind the fences of a labor camp with no record, no trial, and no way home. At the end of the day, remembering this kind of history isn't just about looking backward. It's about understanding the world we live in now. These stories, the forgotten ones, the difficult ones, they remind us how far we've come and how much people endured so that their voices wouldn't disappear completely. And it's important to remember that history never stays frozen in place. Our understanding of it keeps shifting as new files are opened, new testimonies come forward, and forgotten stories return to the surface. Every piece we uncover adds a little more meaning, a little more humanity to what we thought we already knew. And sometimes the deepest truths come from the stories that almost slipped away, the ones that waited in silence until someone cared enough to listen. And if anything we talked about today shows us one thing, it's that even the smallest glimpse into the past can change the way we see the present. Whether it's through real accounts, lost records, or even something as unexpected as a video game mission, every piece helps bring a little more truth back into the light. So if you've stuck with me through all of this, thank you. Taking the time to listen, to learn, and to care, that's what keeps these stories from fading away. And honestly, that's what makes all of this worth doing. And all of that was a bit of the historical context behind what the Call of Duty Black Ops Vorkuta mission is based on. I'll hand it back to Alan because I have fulfilled my duties as an assistant for the day. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Cool, thanks Alyssa. I'll see you back at the office on Monday. History, like what we have covered today, is important because it shows us the parts of the past that aren't always comfortable to face. When people disappear into systems based on secrecy and fear, their stories don't just fade. They're pushed out of sight unless someone chooses to remember them. And once they're forgotten, whole chapters of human suffering slip quietly into the background. That's why it's so important that we not sweep this history under the rug. It shows us what unchecked power can do and how quickly an ordinary person can lose everything in the middle of political forces far beyond their control. And it also gives us a clear view into the Cold War itself. One of the most important things to remember about this era is that so much of it was fought in silence, not on the battlefields, but in interrogation rooms, prisons, intelligence networks, and political shadows. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear threats or tense standoffs. It was about the millions of lives shaped by fear, secrecy, and the constant pressure of two superpowers trying to control the future without ever firing a direct shot. That quiet tension changed the world just as much as any open conflict. That's another reason why I chose this game for the project. Post World War II and the Cold War era has so much secrecy and controversy behind it. The tactics and experimental methods that were used by both sides shows you how far the nations were willing to go to gain an advantage on their adversary. For me, this is one of my favorite games of all time, and the fact that I'm able to do this in general is really cool. And the fact that I'm doing this for school makes it all the more fun to do. I just want to give a huge thanks to my instructor, Mr. Brisson, for allowing me to do this as a project. This is one of the most coolest things I have ever done for school, and I'll always remember this and come back just to watch and listen. If you did enjoy this, you can leave a like or subscribe. Of course, you don't have to, but it'll show me that you like this type of content and maybe I'll post more. Probably not. I'm kind of lazy, but anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope your time at Vorkuta helped with your Russian. Пока удачи, друзья.